one of the examples of any project that you've done for a developer, and what are the challenges that you usually face in having that conversation or pursuing the developer in terms of the required landscape for a particular project versus the cost when it comes?
There is no expected function that is coming out of it. So depending on the approach one wants to take, there are three very broad concepts for roofscapes in the world. One can think of it from a blue, gray, and a green perspective.
Would you really suggest to have landscape balconies or landscape terraces at large?
Yes, certainly, because what you're essentially doing is you're introducing a second skin for the building. There is such a thing as larger social responsibility. So the choices that we make on the kind of development, on the way we design, both as professionals and as developers, has much larger impacts. The government definitely at directing the policy is very critical.
Welcome to the CREDAI Knowledge Series podcast. Today, I'm your host Akshay Mehta, and along with me, I have Mr. Mohan Rao, a partner and principal architect at Integrated Design. Welcome to the podcast, Mohan Rao, sir. Happy to have you here.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
What inspired you to join landscape architecture, and if you can walk us through that journey of yours?
Yes, that's been a long journey. I'm trained as an architect, but very soon after entering into the profession, I realized we needed to do more to address contemporary challenges, be it of environment or social issues. So the natural domain to choose was landscape architecture because that was the one that was closest in terms of its relation to the environment. And since then, it has been a long journey in terms of not just engagement with the profession, but in terms of redefining our own role in society.
So, sir, how important it is for a developer when we speak from a developer perspective to have landscape in their projects, and at what stage they should ideally have a landscape architect on board?
Yes, this is a really important question because the first step is to understand that landscape, like any other field of design, is not a standalone component that can be plugged in at certain points in the project. Increasingly so in our own work and our own engagement with developers, we see that landscape actually forms the framework on which the project is built upon. Real estate, as we understand and know it, is premised on the idea of land, is premised on what you build and how much it is worth. But what is very, very important to understand is that typical projects of any nature, be it a tower block on a podium or a villa project or a mixed-use development, more often than not, rarely cover more than 20 or 30% as footprint,
True.
Which means that we actually have to deal with 70% of this very precious asset of land.
Yeah.
And that is where the understanding of landscape in terms of leveraging the idea of open space, not only from an aesthetic or a recreational purpose, but in actually ensuring that there is a better quality of life, there is a more livable environment, and more importantly, a very healthy environment.
Correct. I think that's very true because when we visit a project, where you see the landscape is done really well, I think it further enhances the entire livability of the project. That becomes the first point of contact for any person because when they're entering, the first thing is they're greeted with the greenscape or the landscape that they have around.
Absolutely. And while the unit, if I can call it that, the dwelling unit, the apartment, are one's own private domain, it's the larger public domain, be it a street, be it an open space, is where the community comes alive.
Correct.
And that is really formed by the quality of the landscape. How inclusive or exclusive is it? How healthy it is? How multifunctional and how accommodating it is of various needs and various age groups becomes very crucial in any project.
So when talking about landscape design, like we have in architecture, you have contemporary design, you have traditional design. Do you have something like this in landscape? Because Every project that we see stands out differently because of its architecture. But can landscape do the same?
It can do the same, but the question is whether it should be doing the same. Because whereas one can think of the building as an object that one can celebrate, you can think of it as a large scale sculpture, which is really the signature of whoever is doing it. It could be the signature of the architect. In some cases, it's also the signature of the developer to say,
Correct.
this is what I have created. However, the big difference between what we traditionally call landscape and what constitutes architecture is that architecture is a static element.
Correct.
It has only three dimensions, whereas landscape has the very important fourth dimension of time, which
Correct.
means it is a dynamic, growing, changing
Correct.
being. To recognize this aspect of the fourth dimension
Correct.
pretty much defines the one approach one can have to landscape. So
Correct.
visually, of course, there are many schools of thought. You could think of it from a classical Greco-Roman Renaissance perspective, which has pretty much ruled 18th and
Correct.
19th century imaginations, to what we see in the latter part of the 20th century, which was more contemporary, more as an extension of the building itself.
Correct.
More built forms, more industrial aspects.
Correct.
So these are what I would call as attitudes to design.
Correct.
But the essence of landscape, as in an abstraction of nature in our own little project, however big or small that may be,
Correct.
is what will determine the approach one would take to design.
That's very true. And also, what I also understand is while we also think it's humans who are going to stay in a particular dwelling, we also have, when we have landscape, we also create a biodiversity. So we're not just having a space that we're creating for humans, but also we're creating a space for other species. So how important it becomes in terms of what kind of selection of plants that we're having? Are we having indigenous plant selections or alien plant selections? And how does that have an impact on a project?
Yes, this has undergone a sea change in the last 50 to 100 years in the profession. Earlier, plant material were only seen as tools of design, a certain aesthetic that
Correct.
one wants to bring in. But increasingly, the limitation of such an approach has been recognized, where you're not calling them just planting design, but you're thinking of it more from a biodiversity management.
Definitely.
So a simple decision like whether we use indigenous or exotic species is not only from a biodiversity perspective, but it has huge impact on, for example, the chemical regime of the soil. How much artificial fertilizer I use in the place? Does this have an impact on the groundwater quality? Does this improve the allergens in the air? So these are increasingly well recognized challenges which are best met with indigenous choice of planting.
Correct. So also, sir, if we want to touch base upon how important like you said about the soil, the kind of quality of soil will also determine what is the kind of species that we need to plant there. So how important is also soil preparation, and what role does it play in terms of percolation of water within the soil so as to reduce the stormwater runoff?
Yes, absolutely. If we were to go to the very, very basic understanding of landscape architecture in its very rudimentary form, you are looking at three primary components: land, vegetation, and water are the three tools, the three elements that determine all aspects of the outdoor spaces. From a traditional design perspective, they have only been looked at it from an aesthetic or a utilitarian perspective. But given the times that we live in, where climate change is very real, resource management and ideas of resilience have taken over the conversation, every intervention that we make, whether it is creating a certain slope in the land, whether it is paving over a certain area, or the choice of vegetation that we use, all of them have cumulative domino effects on the larger
Definitely.
environment.
Yes.
And the choices that we make could be from the perspective of soil erosion to how much porosity there is in the soil to
Correct.
hold water, to most importantly, what is the cumulative effect of these developments on the larger city?
Yes.
Because unlike architectural intervention, any attitude that you have in landscape has multiplying effect on the larger system.
Correct.
So the idea of the choice of material, for example, even if you were to take a simple thing like what kind of trees do we use, is not limited to the person who is walking under the tree alone, but it
Correct.
has a larger impact on the environment.
Yeah.
The kind of bird species that would migrate, the
Yes.
kind of insect species that would habitate, the kind of allergens that will flow in the air. All of these have a much larger impact on the environment.
Yes. So also, when we speak about soil, so what I also, with my limited understanding, understand that the topsoil of any project, of any fertile land, is very important because that's the most fertile. And while we as developers, when we work on a project, probably sometimes these points are not taken into consideration, and the topsoil before doing the footings have been taken out of the site. So, how important it is to maintain that topsoil within the site, or is it okay that it is taken outside the site as well?
Well, conserving any natural resource is very important because if you like the topsoil that you mentioned takes anywhere between 500 to 1,000 years to form in a particular place. If I were to extend that idea to all the horizons of the soil, the topsoil, the disaggregated areas, the bedrocks and things, these have evolved over millennia, sometimes millions of years. And it is very much our responsibility to make sure that we understand the process, and not to say that we are limiting the development by doing this, but we are actually integrating those ideas in the development.
Correct.
Be it topsoil conservation, be it understanding the aquifers. Typically, as professionals, we pay a lot of attention to what is above the ground. We
Correct.
study contours, we study
Yeah.
levels, we need to know where to put retaining walls.
Correct.
An equal amount of attention to the subsoil characteristics. If I were to give you a very crude medical analogy, one can't determine the health of a person by just looking at the condition of a skin.
Correct.
You need to
Definitely.
delve a little deeper to understand what the organism is.
Yeah.
And in this particular case, the soil and the earth is pretty much the determining factor of the health of the environment.
Correct. So talking about aquifers, what you rightly mentioned, I've seen one of your interviews where you also talk about creating spawn cities or spawn centers within the cities. So can you throw some more light on that?
Yes, the term spawn cities itself is fairly recent. For me, it is no more than a hashtag, a useful hashtag, of course. But the idea of a spawn city is essentially driven by two very central concepts. One of resilience, which means that you actually create a system, an organism that is resilient to any kind of change, which means even if there is a damage, it can recover that much faster. And the second equally critical aspect is that of decentralization. What does decentralization mean? Is that I actually decentralize the utilization and the leveraging of resources at every small scale. To give a very simple example, stormwater runoff that you mentioned typically has been seen as somebody else's problem. That I
Correct.
remove it, I put it in the stormwater drain, somebody somewhere needs to manage it.
Correct.
Which is exactly why our cities are flooded. Every time there is even a nominal rainfall, not even extreme rainfall, our
Correct.
cities are flooded. That's essentially coming to the idea of centralization, where everybody's problem is being taken out
Correct.
into becoming part of no one's problem.
Yes.
So, if every single development, be it a real estate, be it institution, whatever, if I were to be responsible for the resources that are on my land, the rain that is incident on my land, then I'm making sure that I am stressing the system outside that much lesser. I'm also leveraging those resources that much better for myself.
Correct. Correct. I think fairly put out in terms of how each resident has to take care of the kind of water resource that they have and how they should take care of the zero discharge from their own particular unit. I think if that happens, then probably it also solves the larger problem of the floods, where all the water from a resident unit is also not put out onto the to be handled by the stormwater
Absolutely.
drain of the
Absolutely.
government. So yes, we have such different stakeholders. So we have government to play a role here. We have a resident to play a role here. We have a developer. Then we have the residents of the developer. So what role or what responsibilities do each of these have to take in order to mitigate this issue?
Yes, this is always a very difficult question because we always find the nearest victim and say it's your problem, not mine.
Exactly.
So, since each of us is doing it, there's no one to actually take the complete accountability for it.
Correct.
I believe the process is driven not just from the top down, from the government to the client to the consultant downwards, but it also is a two-way process. Speaking only as a professional who is involved in this, I'm pretty much in the middle of the spectrum. There
Okay.
are larger issues, societal governance issues on one side, and then there are the down the stream issues of the client, the land, and the end user. And from that perspective, it becomes very, very important that we understand both aspects of the spectrum and enable systems that are convenient, they are resilient, and they're efficient from the end user perspective, but at the same time are not adding to the problems of the larger city.
Correct. 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 So now moving on to another segment of our podcast. What are the things that a developer should keep in mind while he is selecting a landscape architect?
Yes. So for me, when I have this conversation with clients, let's say a developer, one of the first things that I try to communicate is that, like I was saying in the beginning,
Yes.
any development will typically not have more than 20-30% of building footprint,
Good.
which means as an asset, I'm still responsible for the larger 70%. And that larger 70% cannot simply be given over to roads and parking.
Correct.
This is a very, very precious asset that will remain with us forever for every
Correct.
resident. So rather than take a very siloed approach, which has pretty much defined most of the profession for many, many decades, it's good to think of it as a collaborative effort. This is not to say the architect slash landscape architect slash master planner is the only leader. Each of us have a very, very important role to play in the process.
Correct.
And that can only be dealt with in an efficient manner if everyone is brought to the same table at the very beginning of the project.
100%.
Not to think of landscape as an aesthetic intervention where I put some grass, I put some trees, I put an open gym, and I'm done with my responsibility.
Correct.
That's a very reductionist approach. It really doesn't help save cost in any way. And it really does not help address the core issues of resources and resilience.
Yeah. So if you can tell us one of the examples of any project that you've done for a developer, and what are the challenges that you usually face or the common problems that you really face in having that conversation or pursuing the developer in terms of the required landscape for a particular project versus the cost when it comes. Because usually what happens is landscape becomes one of that area where it is given an afterthought usually, and it because it comes at the end, the last part of the project at the handover stage. So one, the cost becomes a very bigger factor because at the end of the project the developer usually wants to complete the project and move on to the next one. So what is the cost per square feet that the developer should have in mind ideally at the start of the project? And second, if you can tell us what are the challenges that you face while having this conversation with the developers?
Yeah, so this is it's pretty much like writing a thesis on the profession as far as the developers are concerned, because there are many, many aspects to this. For me, the beginning of any conversation is for all of us to understand that we are on the same team.
Correct.
typically the approach is that, oh, I am the developer, I need to save money, I need to maximize the profit, and here is this landscape architect who's making me spend a lot of money, so I don't like you. So that actually defeats the whole purpose of the conversation.
100%.
If we all agree that we are on the same team, what are we trying to essentially achieve other than the economics and the profitability, which is a given? What you're doing is that you are trying to create a lifetime asset for the users. Most families will end up living in these developments for generations.
100%.
And that cannot happen only by using the cheapest material or by creating the most conservative technologies. You're talking about experiences, you're talking about the aspect of time that I mentioned. But most importantly, and this for the next 20 years is going to dominate every conversation in the profession, is that of resilience. How do we look at environmental challenges? How do you look at urban heat island, increasing rainfall, climate change, air quality? People in, say, Bangalore, for example, are very lucky that this is not a matter of conversation. But if you're in most other cities, as we see increasingly over the last few years, air quality is not just dangerous, it is toxic levels.
Correct.
And that simply doesn't happen because I'm blaming the farmer somewhere else. I'm equally responsible for that. So when we agree that these are the larger challenges, and within our limited role in a limited place, how do we address those things? Coming to the idea of the cost, if I see landscape architecture as an addition, a necessary evil that is required to sell the project, then there is no conversation. I will choose the cheapest material and be done with it.
True.
But if I actually recognize that I am the steward of this large parcel of land, and this is what the people in that area will grow up with, the children will experience, this
True.
will morph and change over a period of time, then our priorities would be very different.
Yeah.
And most importantly, when I see landscape not just as an aesthetic expression, but as a performing landscape, an infrastructure that is very critical, be it from the soil health management to water management to biodiversity to air quality, then the idea of the cost becomes more realistic. Then you're able to say, if I'm saying 200 rupees a square foot, I'm just throwing a random number. You're not looking at it as a standalone cost. You're looking at it from the life cycle cost of the project.
Correct.
And then any developer, at least the ones that we have been happy enough to work with, do see the value in bringing this up. This is not seen as a luxury that needs to be imposed on a project, but as a very essential quality that
Correct.
is required.
Yeah. So, can you also tell us what are some common misconceptions that developers have about landscape architecture? One, definitely you addressed about the cost part of it. But other than that, do you think that developers have some misconception about landscape?
Yes, unfortunately, this is a responsibility of both the developers and my own profession, because we need to communicate the value that we bring to the table. And the developers equally should recognize the long-term value of something being done. Cost definitely is one major criteria.
Yes.
One frequent argument we come across is, oh, we don't want landscape that is very heavy on maintenance,
Yeah.
right? Which is a bit of an oxymoron. If I have a living, growing being in my vicinity
Correct.
and say, I will not take care of it, I will not feed it, it's like having a pet in your house.
Correct.
Can you imagine any of us saying, I'm not going to feed the pet or take it for a walk, but I want it to be healthy?
Yeah.
So, however, having said that, what most people do not realize is that maintenance of a very large, extensive landscape costs 1/4 the price of maintaining a glass facade. We happily build glass facade buildings. We pay 4, 6, 8 rupees per square foot for cleaning that space.
Correct.
which is not considered a cost because it's glossy. It's I want to look good,
Correct.
right? I'm not going to have a dirty building.
Yeah.
But at one-fourth that price, if I have to water and maintain and nurture a landscape, it is seen as a very big cost. So
Yeah.
I think this is more an attitude rather
Correct.
than an economic argument.
Talking about maintenance, can you also tell us something about zericulture?
Yes, zericulture essentially means xeriscape, zericulture. It's known by many different names, using those kind of species or choice of design tools that minimizes the use of water.
Okay.
Uh, it's very much valid, but again, it is defined by the context.
Okay.
When we did, let's say, the campus for IIT in Jodhpur, it makes perfect sense to deploy zericulture because water is at a premium.
Correct.
If I'm doing a podium landscape in Bangalore, I am actually struggling to see how do I dispose of the STP water
Correct.
that comes out of the project. So it makes no sense to actually use xeriscaping in a developer project,
Correct.
especially where you have recycled water
To be used.
in abundance. It's
Correct.
available in abundance. Many of these are interesting ideas, but I think I would be very careful in using it as a formula. I would not simply say xeriscaping is what will save the world. There will be 50 other things that will save the world. This is one such tool, which if I'm doing a project for an industry in Bellary, for example, xeriscaping is the way to go.
Yeah.
I would not do that if I'm doing a villa project in Sarjapur.
So, talking about the project that you're doing in Jodhpur, and through our previous conversation before the podcast, you were talking about that's a large scale project, almost around 1100 acres. Working on a varied scale from 1100 acre to a 20 acre, how does it feel? I mean, when you're working on a very large scale project, 1100 acre, which is like almost a city, and then working on a small scale project. So, how do you transit yourself while you're at work from working on such large scale to a small scale project?
Yes. You need to have very different neural networks that switch from one scale to another through the day, and that is a challenge in the profession. And I would not complain. In fact, I'm very fortunate to be in a position where I'm actually dealing with such a large spectrum. But what does become important is to understand that it is not all about design alone. In a very small boutique space, physical visual design becomes more important. But in the larger spaces, it is the process, it is the integration, it is addressing many of the larger issues that I mentioned: decentralization, resilience, climate change. So the approach to each of these projects is actually determined not just by the scale, but also by the context and the end user.
Okay.
In some cases, they are closed projects, such as the IIT, which means it has a definite boundary. In many cases, there are urban projects or heritage projects, which actually involves or impacts everyone in the city. So then the approach to such a space comes from a position of responsibility and not merely saying, this is my work.
But so when it comes to a tight scale project where you don't really have a space on the ground to do any other than the fire driveway, and then you're only forced to either have a vertical landscape or the landscape on the terrace. So how viable is that to have a landscape on the terrace where it is directly exposed to the sun? And also how difficult it is in terms of maintaining this vertical landscapes?
Yes, roofscapes are going to be very, very important with the level of urbanization we are seeing in India. Because, like you rightly mentioned, there is not enough ground space to play with. They will be mostly taken over by services. So, the only exposed part of the building that I actually have access to is the roof.
Correct.
And roofs are very critical also because that's the only clean open space which is non-functional, quote unquote. There is no expected function that is coming out of it. So depending on the approach one wants to take, there are three very broad concepts for roofscapes in the world. one can think of it from a blue, gray, and a green perspective. Blue is where I use the entire terrace or the roofscape to trap and harvest and manage water. Gray is when I deploy the entire roofscape as a energy management system,
Okay.
solar PV, etc., etc. And green, of course, is the most obvious one where a garden is made. And creating such a garden will not even create a small dent in the larger budget,
Okay.
not even a very, very small dent.
Yes.
So people keep talking about, oh, what if it leaks? If it rains, also it will leak. You don't need to have plants there for it to leak, right?
That's very true.
So, again, like I said, it's a question of attitude. But most important is not just the functional aspect of creating a roof garden. Roof gardens are extremely critical in managing urban floods.
Okay.
The amount of rainfall that falls, the amount that the soil and the green slows down that water before it is spread out, the amount it can contribute to reduce the urban heat island in a space. So from a climate and ecology perspective, it's actually very, very important. They contribute substantially.
But in terms of say cost, is it same to have a rooftop garden versus on the Mother Earth?
Yes and no. Yes, because here we are looking at a place where there is no option to have
Correct.
Mother Earth,
Yeah.
right? Which is why we are relying on this.
Yeah.
No, because the amount that you would actually invest, whether it is in the structural system or in the services, is already embedded in the building. It's if I'm building, let's say, a 30-story building, the addition of 500 kg per square meter of the roof load is negligible. It's not even a percentage point.
Okay.
Services are already embedded. So I'm not doing any additional service. The only additional component will be that of maintenance.
Okay.
And that, like I mentioned, is a very worthy investment to make.
Correct. Definitely. Because also what happens is roof becomes the most neglected part. Like you said, it is no one really expects any
Absolutely.
activity out of that space. And but when you really have a landscape on this kind of rooftop, you're further encouraging the residents also to be a part of the space and
Absolutely.
utilize this space in a different way. So yeah. So I think that can also become a very nice amenity for a developer's point of view, but also a nice, and also it can also reduce the urban heat island effect.
Absolutely.
Where the lower floor residents won't really have that much of heat otherwise that they would have.
Correct.
So yes.
So I think the idea of scale is quite important. Irrespective of the scale of the project, we talked about several components. We talked about a simple thing like the fire driveway or the podium or the roofscape or integration of water and energy systems.
Correct.
These become increasingly important even in inner city areas, even for very small projects.
Correct.
So it may not be our conventional understanding of landscape architecture, which is to put lawns and trees, which is it's a very unfortunate imagination of the profession. But it's important for especially developers to realize that landscape as a performing infrastructure, not as a static aesthetic thing that can be added on, but something that is very integral to the project, is important at every scale.
Correct.
Not just because I have a large site do I need to talk to a landscape architect. This is not about pushing the profession, but to merely understand the criticality of the issues.
Correct. Great. I mean, that's really nice. But do we have any such model city in India?
There's no one model city, but I can see several examples of this in the different parts that I work in. I mean, to give a simple example, Karnataka banned the use of natural river sand.
Okay, yeah, correct.
Some years ago. It created havoc. Everyone protested, saying, how are we ever going to build?
Correct.
It's now been 10 years. Does anyone even remember what river sand looks like? Correct. Every construction is done by M-Sand, and it has done wonders for the river ecologies, which we in the city do not realize.
Correct.
So these are domino impacts that happen.
Correct.
Hyderabad, for example, has a policy of zero discharge. The
Yes.
city does not give you a stormwater connection,
Oh,
which means that you are forced to manage the water that falls on your thing. Now, what is the motivation for such a law? How do I circumvent it? These are different conversations.
correct.
But we have several, Pune has some of the best energy efficiency norms for
Correct.
builders and developers.
Yes.
Uh, Indore has really good laws in place that looks at mobility
Yeah.
and cycling and things. So there are all in bits and pieces. I would not say it's, I would not be the skeptic to say nothing good is happening. There are
Correct.
lots of good things happening in different bits and pieces, but it's also our responsibility to see how do we take that to the next level.
Correct. Is there something that even IGBC promotes in terms of landscape? Because IGBC promotes otherwise for definitely energy.
Yes, IGBC does have a separate section now. It's been introduced only a few years ago that looks at qualitative assessment of landscape areas
Okay.
in terms of how much of the space is given over to hardscape. What is the albedo level of these hardscape materials? Is it contributing to the urban heat island?
Correct.
What are the choices of species being used?
Yeah.
What is the consumption of water per square meter or acre?
Correct.
So there are several norms that have become part of many rating systems. It could be IGBC, could be TERI, could be any of these things.
Correct. That's true. I think we had a lot of good exchange of information and knowledge, and I think it has been a very nice conversation where we understand that usually we should take landscape architect at the start of the project when we are also taking the other stakeholders of the project. Because they will also help us determine in terms of master planning for the project along with collaborating with the architect. We've also learned of how the concept of the spawn cities and how spawn cities also help in creating this decentralized areas where you can really have soaking of the water and not just having the stormwater runoff, which can further have a lot of flood effects. We also learned about how we can create nice landscape not just on the ground but also onto the terraces, which is usually a larger problem in the CBD area to find some space on the ground. So thank you so much, sir, for such an insightful conversation and for giving us your valuable time today.
It's
Thank you
been a
so
real
much.
pleasure, Akshay. Thank you so much.